Welcome to Duchenne Science Live from Action Duchenne. My name's Neil.
And my name's Sid.
And this week we'll be talking about a paper from Jarod Wong's lab in University of Glasgow. And it's on the back of the study funded by Action Duchenne, Muscular Dystrophy UK and the Scottish Scientists' Office. It's looking at the assessment of vertebral fractures on DEXA images and how that assessment can vary depending on the experience of the observer, the experience of the person doing the actual scoring. I mean, we know that Duchenne, obviously it's a muscle wasting condition, but one of the symptoms is weaker bones.
You talk about bone weakness. Well, why is the bone weak? Because it's lost density.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one example would be if you think of a concrete block, you can get those in all sorts of density. It just tells you how heavy, concrete blocks are all the same size. Density tells you how heavy they are. If you get a really, really dense concrete block, it'll hold an awful lot of weight. If you get a really, really low density one, they're great for insulating.
So the Breeze box all full of bubbles.
Exactly, to make them lighter, make them better insulators, but that comes with a reduction in strength. And bone is exactly the same. Less dense bone is not as strong as dense bone. And so if you're worried about bone weakness, you really want to keep an eye on the density of the bone. And obviously lots of people with Duchenne are given steroids. And one of the side effects of steroids is weakening the bones as well. So people who are living with Duchenne and taking steroids, they're at a much increased risk of fractures. And obviously fractures are painful, but they can also limit mobility and things. So it's really important that bone health is monitored. And the standards of care say that people should be assessed for spinal fractures every 1 to 2 years if they're taking steroids, or every 2 to 3 if they're not taking steroids. I think in the UK, it's generally said, every year or so. And that lets people really monitor the bone health. And what you really want to find is that first fracture. What you don't want to see is somebody after, a few years where they've had multiple spinal fractures. So it's all about monitoring regularly to find the first fracture so you can keep a close eye on them and treat, as soon as treatment's needed. So you can treat with a drug called bisphosphonate. And, at the moment, the standards of care say you should treat severe or moderate fractures. And if it's a mild fracture, you can wait and see before beginning treatment. And so DEXA is one of the things that's used to monitor bone health in Duchenne.
Are we allowed to know what DEXA means? Or is it's a lovely acronym?
Okay, so we're talking about dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, or DEXA. And we're going to call it DEXA for this whole thing because that's a challenge to say.
Yes, wise, I think. I was going to say, so the DEXA, now the iDEXA, the advanced version, is looking at bone density. So DEXA can also be used to look at fractures, not just bone density, but it does require a practiced eye.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, if you're in the UK, most of the big centres now have one of these iDEXA machines. And so if you haven't had a spinal X-ray, that doesn't mean your spine isn't being monitored. So if you haven't had a spinal X-ray, but you've had a DEXA scan, then that can do exactly the same job as a spinal X-ray. Yeah, and I think people will be well used to TV medical documentaries where you see the people holding up the X-ray film. It's the same idea. You're going to look at an image from a DEXA scan and assess it and look for fractures, but the images look different, and training those people or learning how to interpret them is really important. And I think that's what this paper is all about, isn't it?
So in this study, 3 different people looked at the same scans, and 2 were experienced. One was very experienced in looking in particular at DEXA scans. That was their job.
Yep.
One was a clinician, or is this...
Yeah. So the second one was a clinician who was an expert in Duchenne and had worked in DEXA scans in Duchenne for some years. So they were an expert reader. And then the third person was somebody who had no prior experience of analysing these kinds of scans. So you've got 2 people who are very well trained, very experienced, and 1 person who's less well trained, less experienced, but understands what a DEXA image is, and knows what.
Sort of had a crash course in this particular
Yeah, I guess that's the way to. Yeah.
And so they looked at all of the same ones, and then the comparison was made of the conclusions that they reached. That is the grading of the fractures seen into mild, moderate, and severe.
Yeah, and I mean those are the bands that are defined in the standards of care, if you like. So that's what everyone tries to use because that's the standard. So yeah, it's all about going from the picture to one of those words. It's that process.
And they did that, and looking at the assessments they made, the two experienced readers, their observations matched almost perfectly. They came to very much the same conclusions looking at those scans. And the person who'd had the crash course, making their assessments, they saw the same fractures, and they assessed them. They didn't miss anything. But in terms of the grading of mild, moderate, and severe, they actually graded some of them higher than the experienced readers did, which sort of meant sense psychologically. You don't want to be downplaying or underplaying anything. So I think if you're new to something and nervous about it, I would imagine that would be like, well, I don't want anything that to go past me.
And I guess that's not unsurprising, right? That you would expect people who've been trained and have lots of experience to do this very similarly, and you'd expect someone with less training, less experience, possibly to do it differently or slightly differently. And it's not unsurprising, as you say, that they would overscore rather than underscore. I guess the important thing here is that the people where they were overscoring, if you had taken just that person's assessment, what it would mean is you might end up kind of over treating people. So treating people where they may not need treating. So it's those people we were talking about earlier where, you know, a mild fracture, you may be able to watch and wait, see what happens. Often people wouldn't ever report on this kind of thing. It's one of those things that I'm sure everybody would accept as something that happens. You know, if you get people to look at images, of course they see slightly different things and report it slightly different ways. But it's what that means in terms of, you know, the Duchenne field, in terms of care and in terms of trials, is actually the really interesting thing here, isn't it? You know, clinical trials, the whole point of those is that they're incredibly standardized, incredibly carefully controlled. And so now you've got a question of, if you've got something like DEXA in your clinical trial, how do you compare those results, right? You've got 30 centers, let's say. So you might have 30 densitometrists assessing the DEXA scans. But actually, if they're all assessing them even slightly differently, it becomes really, really hard to use that data at the end of the clinical trial to compare across all the centers and say for sure what's happening.
Yes.
And so how do you fix that problem? I guess the easy one is to centralize it. It's to get away from having 30 densitometrists and move towards having a few densitometrists who see all the scans from the whole trial, and then they score everything the same way.
Well, depending on the size of the clinical trial, that might be feasible, but not perhaps always. And it would be, I think, better for all. And as I say, we mentioned, especially if you're broadening this out in terms of assessment for other children, for other conditions where bone density is being looked at, and vertebral fractures would be assessed, then it would be great if everybody had a really clear sort of training and standardized, or, you know, standards of care.
So some kind of uniform scale almost, that all these images are always assessed in exactly the same way.
Yes, but I think the authors of this paper were saying that they were. I mean, they were all using the same type of assessment to reach these grading conclusions, but they potentially were saying that you could make the assessment super tailored for looking at kids' bones,
Yeah, got you.
So that would be really good to make sure that everyone was really familiar with looking at using this for children.
Yes.
Bottom
Yeah.
line. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't just apply what you know from adults to the
No.
bones of children, because it's
So yeah, and that was a sort of training and a standard that was available to all people that were involved in assessing these type of images. So all your clinicians, anybody else who was going to be using these type of scans regularly for that purpose. And so there would be universality, consistency in reporting, which means consistency in management going forward. And it's not, but at no point we're not denigrating at any level the expertise of those that make, who've had years of using this kind of imaging to come to conclusions. It's just to have it.
I think that's really important, isn't it? We're not saying here that there's anything wrong with how these images are being assessed or the care given to people on the basis of these images. It's all about trying to make sure everything happens the same and everyone gets the same care, and standardizing things across as many places as possible. It's all about consistency of care.
Yes.
So this paper came from Jarod Wong's lab in Glasgow. We thought we'd end the show today by giving a quick shout out for a research project that Jarod's doing at the moment, looking at the side effects that people think are important in steroids. It's a short survey. They're asking families and adults living with Duchenne to just answer a few questions about what they think are the most important side effects. Hopefully this will be useful in the future for other families trying to decide whether to take steroids, which steroid to take. So collecting really useful information on side effects of steroids, and we'll put the link in the chat box below the video.
Great.
So I hope you've enjoyed this week's show. We'll see you next week for the next exciting installment of Duchenne Science Live.